Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today it's another solo episode with your favorite guest, Scott M. Greer. So I hope you enjoy it today. Should be a quick and easy episode, but every time I do one of these, it ends up being an hour. So I'll try to make sure it's not 2 hours or 3 hours today. We got a few topics to talk about. So the main issue I want to discuss today is this topic of working class conservatism, or is the GOP the working man's party? This has been a very popular point of discussion ever since Trump won in 2016. Actually, ever since Trump was running for office, is that he presented a new type of GOP and a new type of conservatism. And the stereotype is that it's all people at country clubs just talking about the stock market and business and capital gains tax. Well, here was a guy who was representing the blue collar interests and was putting their interests at the forefront of his movement. With Trump gone, people are still talking about this, and there was a New Republic article about this written by one Christopher Caldwell, who's an incredible writer. He's a Claremont Institute fellow. He wrote a very good book called The Age of Entitlement last year. I highly recommend everyone read Age of Entitlement. It's like about how the Civil Rights Revolution took over America, overthrew the traditional conception of the Constitution, and made our country a whole lot worse. So it's a very base book. And usually every article he writes is very good. Highly recommended, very insightful. But this one he wrote about working class conservatism, a little disappointed by it, because it was like full of a lot of what we've been seeing as con Inc. Not necessarily con Inc., but populist Inc. cliches on what the future is. And he interviews all these people who are not necessarily very good, such as Orrin Cass, who's a former Mitt Romney senior advisor who now runs American Compass. And he's trying to build a new conservatism that's based around these wonky economic proposals. And he's somebody who wants to transform Trumpism and ditch all the cultural and identity issues and just focus on trade policy and tax subsidies. And they interview this person as someone very good. Julius Krein, who's the editor of American Affairs, who disavowed Trump after Charlottesville, is another person who wants to ditch all the cultural and identity stuff and just focus on economic issues. And then he highlights the three senators that are supposedly going to create a working class conservatism: Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, and Tom Cotton. I understand kind of Hawley and Cotton there, and there's like the commentary on them is decent. But the stuff about Rubio being like a genuine working class conservative is just so laughable. I mean, he does note that when he first was coming up as a politician, he was all about libertarianism, but now he's switching because he feels that this is the way he can win the presidency on. And you're just like, what? Marco Rubio still is an immigration booster. I mean, he does, even though he's not as bad on immigration as he was in 2013, he is still someone you can't trust on this issue. And immigration is the defining issue of Trumpism and what Trump ran on in 2016. It's how he won. And to take the opposite position on that fundamental issue is, that's completely antithetical to whatever working class conservatism you would want. Anyway, the article, that's mainly the critiques of it, and it does encourage this mindset that the Republican Party can become the working man's party with these wonky economic proposals that are becoming more pro-union, and that's how we can replicate Trump without Trump. And that doesn't really understand the Trump phenomenon, as I've said repeatedly, is that Trump's like insults, his boisterous behavior, it's a populist attitude is really what drew these people to him. I mean, it was like WWE as a politician, and that's why they liked him. And Orrin Cass is not WWE. Julius Krein is not WWE. These guys are both wear glasses. They're like these egghead intellectuals. There's not really any working class attitude about them. That's not necessarily how you want to be represented as working class conservatism, as this guy with a squeaky voice, like telling you about how like this family tax subsidy is really going to help working class families. Like, no, they want like somebody who's like going to cater to their interests, somebody who's going to have this attitude of just like tearing down the establishment. And even the three Republicans they cite, Hawley and Cotton have good things about him. I mean, Cotton has a horrible foreign policy, but on domestic policy, he's probably the best senator. he didn't challenge the election results, which in the end was probably politically beneficial to him. But, that is something that makes him suspicious. Hawley, on paper is great, but in reality, he doesn't really get it. And Rubio sucks. So none of these three are necessarily people who can replicate Trump. It is very hard to replicate Trump. I will want to say that. There is a point to this, and I think, but there's less of a point now than there was in, say, 2015 and 2016. If you're saying this like economic populist stuff back in 2015, it was a way of signaling that you were opposed to conservative BS. That you were, there's still that now, but you are more. The opponent is much weaker. And it was also a stand-in for not saying stuff about like racial and cultural issues. Is that, I'm trying to care about the white working class, that I'm trying to care about this. And these conservatarians are too worried about corporations and the wealthy 1%. And you would say this stuff in order to counteract all the stupidity that was around you. Well, now you don't really have, libertarianism is no longer a sin. Libertarianism is an easy to pick on, a nerdy kid at school that everyone shoves in the locker. Everyone hates him. No one's going on dates with libertarianism. That's who you're picking on. You're picking on an easy target with this stuff. And all these people imagine that like, libertarianism is this great, powerful thing that we must continue to counteract. And it's like, not at the same extent as it was in 2014. In 2014, pre-Trump, this was the stuff that you had all over conservative ink. This is what the conservative movement was all about. It was all about conservatarianism. And you needed this message, like just common sense messages about trade, about like not hating the working class, about, wanting to create benefits for American workers. Just because these libertarians are like, absolutely not. We can't allow that. No, more free markets, and so there was a bigger point to that. And now you're boxing with an opponent that is far weaker, that it's like, yes, it still has some influence over Republican politicians. A lot of these conservative institutions, such as Heritage, are still influenced by it, but it's not to the same extent that they were at that time. It's not and people just imagine that, like, I want to have this policy just to own the libertarians. This was a more admirable position in 2014, 2015, when this was like the predominant, movement on the right that seemed like it was going to have, whatever the presidential candidate in 2016 before Trump entered looked like that person was going to be more libertarian than at any point in time. So yeah, there was a point to saying I stand with this policy just to own the libertarians. But now it's like kind of silly to do that. Back then, it was a way to signal that you are not a conservative shithead, that you actually, understand these issues about immigration, about race, about culture, about identity. And then you are not like one of these goobers who was, excited for Rand Paul's like a Detroit Republican shtick. It was a way of signaling that you were not like an idiot. And I think today it's not necessarily that. And I think the one problem that they're having is that our main contention back then, among the dissident right, was to say that economics is not the primary issue, is that this stuff about like free markets and limited government is pointless unless you understand the cultural and identity issues. And we wanted those at the forefront. And criticizing their stupid economic policies and their economic rhetoric that was like imagining that every person could just pick up themselves up by the bootstraps and that we could eliminate the minimum wage, and that like the biggest problem was the government and that's what was driving everyone poor. Yeah, there was right to mock that. But then trying to replace going in a different direction and having these left of center economics and making that the primary focus is just as mistaken, because what we want to do is to emphasize the cultural and identity issues. That's what we care about, and that was what our main contention was with the conservative wing and the Republican Party then. It's like, no, we want you to fight for our people, not to fight for corporate interests. And now they're like imagining that our people are, organized labor, the big unions like AFL-CIO, and people who work in the service sector who are at Quiznos or Chipotle and they're demanding a minimum wage. And it's imagining that it becomes too obsessed with the economic populism, and it ignores the real central issues of what we're about. And there's that danger in that. And I think that's like Trump did not do that. I mean, the main reason that he won was due to the cultural and identity issues. The voters who gravitated towards him was because of the cultural and identity issues, not because of the economic walkery. I mean, they did like the stuff that he was saying about trade protection and a few other things, and the fact that he wasn't just like tied to these conservative dogmas that, said that the government could never intervene in the economy. They liked that he, dispensed with that. But and same with like healthcare. It's like during the 2016 campaign, he was not one of these people who was like the answer is full on privatization, and everyone's like, no, we don't want that. So he had common sense economics, but ultimately it was about cultural and identity issues. And you can't avoid this topics about race and ethnicity and culture when it comes to this. And I think a lot of these people who want to have an economic populism, but from the right, fail to understand this. I think one thing is that we can have a wide range of economic perspectives and difference of opinion on that, because our primary focus is these cultural and identity issues. But I think if you're approaching any economic topic, it should be informed by race and culture. Those are topics that you really have to focus on, and this will inform the proper opinion about it. I think a lot of these people have some misinterpretations of our current workplace environment and what our current country looks like, and they instead transpose this 1930s ideal. I don't know necessarily if it's an ideal, because you imagine these hard-bitten workers and they're covered in suit, and they're just like coming out of the factory, and they're like, I want my minimum wage increase, and I'm ready. I have these conservative beliefs, and I'm really right-wing, but I'm also a guy working at a steel factory from the 1930s. And too many people imagine that all these economic issues operate around this, that we have this economy, this pre-World War II economy, or even like an economy, in the immediate years after the post-war. I mean, we're in a very different economic situation, and a lot of these, economic issues that we're talking about now, it's a very different demographics we're talking about. This is not necessarily these white ethnics that are going to are reaping the benefits from this. So there are three issues that I think that a lot of these people who are into the economic populist angle and to the detriment of the cultural and identity issues really, grasp onto and say, like, we want this, we really support these items. And due to the fact that they ignore the racial and cultural elements involved, they come out with in total support of these ideas that sound good on the face of it. But when you really investigate, there should be some more skepticism about it. The first, of course, and I've talked about this endlessly, is the student loan debt forgiveness, which, if you're looking at the rhetoric coming from the left, they're saying this is a racial justice issue, that we have to do this because, black and brown people disproportionately have student loan debt compared to whites. And, yes, even if it did benefit blacks and Hispanics, it would still theoretically benefit whites. But when you look at the white people who are benefiting, it's not working class whites who are working in a steel factory. Like, I paid $80K for my Master's of Fine Arts degree, and I can't have white children because of this student loan debt, and now I need to get rid of this. And this is like some of the mythology that these people promote. The people who are going to be promoted, who are most benefit from this, are members of the professional managerial class, the people who spent six figures to get a graduate degree and law or urban planning or whatever middle class professional profession, that's a great word, whatever white collar profession they went into, and that's who's going to benefit from it. And it's not necessarily a thing that helps our people, and our people are not people. Well, I mean, some of them may be in the professional managerial class, but those aren't if you're looking at the polling numbers and the people who are really getting these advanced graduate degrees, those aren't necessarily our people. And most of those people can't afford their student loan debt. I mean, if they're successful. I mean, the people who really can't afford it are like members of Antifa who spent like six figures to get some art degree, and now they can only work at Starbucks, and that's why they're burning down the courthouses it's because they're so angry that, their, own poor decisions led them down this path. There's some sympathy that can be offered to that, but that person is not our people. And that's what you really need. That's really how you need to address all these issues. Like, does this help our people? And our people are middle Americans who are living in flyover country. That's who our main demographic is. And that's what you really need to see as our people. And if this is not helping our people, and if it's helping a lot of people we see as our enemies, which student loan debt does do, because most of these people who have advanced degrees are all about white privilege, all about critical race theory, all about overthrowing the historic American nation, then, and even to the opposite extent that a lot of these people are involved in Antifa, then why do you want to bail them out? So that's the one thing you need to approach with student loan debt. I've talked about this in previous episodes, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. The second thing I want to talk about is minimum wage increase, which on paper looks like a great idea. I mean, you think that this, it's very hard to live in this country on $10 an hour. Why don't you give them $15 an hour? And you're like, yeah, and you don't like these corporations, these evil corporations are exploiting the working man, and they should, Walmart and Amazon should give them a fair wage. Okay, granted, that's a sensible argument, and I understand where that's coming from. But the very important but, this is those giant corporations can afford the cost of it. Like, Walmart can afford to pay people $15 an hour. The people who can are these small businesses in flyover country, which many of our people are small business owners. Like, if you just run a minor painting company, in Columbia, Tennessee, and you really can't afford to pay necessarily some of your people, $15 an hour, you're going to suffer from that, and your business is going to go under. And it's even looking at these rural towns where you have a mom and pop shop, and not necessarily, $10 an hour. That you can live out there on that. That's like very different from living $10 an hour in Washington, D.C. or Seattle, Washington. So, yeah, but then they increase it to $15 an hour. Now the mom and pop business can't afford that. They go under, and who benefits the most? It's the Walmart in that rural town, which can afford that. So now you're solidifying these giant corporations and their power, and you're shutting down these small businesses and these, you are hurting necessarily our people with this minimum wage increase. And you're not necessarily giving a benefit to our people. It's like a lot of the people who are in the working class, they're welders, they're HVAC repairmen. And if you look, and even the Christopher Caldwell article, it pointed out all HVAC repairmen and all of these working class professions that probably make a lot more than the minimum wage went overwhelmingly for Trump. And so those people aren't necessarily going to get the benefit. It's going to be the people who are working at, Quiznos or, a Whataburger, if they're in Texas, of course. And those are going to be the people who are going to be benefiting. And a lot of those people aren't necessarily our people, as those people are working in the service sector. And there was a recent article, I think it was in The Spectator, and it was talking about the people who are involved in Antifa. And it made the point that a lot of these are failed members of the professional managerial class. They didn't use necessarily the term the lumpen bourgeoisie, but those what there are, and those are the people who they spent some time at community college or they failed out of their state school, and for their own reasons, because they're into drugs or they just can't function, and their parents are middle class, but they're working at a Chipotle, and they're angry, and they will necessarily get the benefit because Chipotle and these massive chains can afford the $15 increase. The big corporations can't afford it. Small businesses can't. So you're going to put them out of business, and that re-entrenches corporate power, which is not what we're necessarily for. It's not necessarily a policy that helps our people. And in theory, it's a good idea. Like, I don't have this revulsion towards the minimum wage. Like, this is an outrage of the government. Like, the government can't tell me how much to pay my workers. It's like, I think a bare minimum, yes, they can. I support the idea of the minimum wage. I'm not a full-on libertarian who thinks the minimum wage is tyranny. But necessarily raising it to an extent that most small businesses can't afford, then it's not gonna be good. And there's even some people who, there's an immigration restrictionist element to it. Is that Ron Unz used to, push for a minimum wage increase in order to stemmy the tide, stymie, I think it would be stymie. Sorry for my mispronunciations. But stem the tide of immigration that was flowing in, and that these people would turn to, they would pay native workers a fair and living wage. Well, not necessarily going to happen. It's just going to force them to move to automation, which, I mean, in some cases may be beneficial, might not be in other cases. So you're going to be pushing to that, but also, once again, these small businesses, the mom and pop shops, a small painting company, these people who are not necessarily, raking in the, a massive corporation, can't afford automation either. So I don't think it, you really have to approach this issue, and every issue is like, does this help our people? And a minimum wage increase does not. The third topic, or issue, that economic populists really obsess over and desperately needs a analysis from a race and cultural perspective is pro-natalism. And this topic came up recently because last week Mitt Romney proposed a very generous child tax benefit that would send a $3,000 check every year to families. It would change depending on how many children you have and how many and how old they are. But this is like a straight check. It's almost similar to the straight checks that were issued, or were supposed to be issued for for Corona. And of course, we're not necessarily getting those checks now under Biden. But yes, it's under the same mentality as that. And the same theory is just cutting them direct checks. And Romney's bill also eliminates some of these welfare benefits that have encouraged families that are not necessarily our people to have more kids. So on the surface, it's pretty good. And actually, I look at it, I don't think it's that bad. I think it's actually a pretty good idea. And it would benefit our people a lot because the people who are generally people who vote Republican are more likely to be married people with kids. So they would be getting checks. And that's a nice benefit. So I don't necessarily think that this is a bad idea, particularly what Mitt Romney's proposing. And it eliminates forms of welfare that are not what we support. It's also a political win for Republicans to endorse such a measure. I mean, pretty much everyone's going to like this idea. I mean, you don't want to be the person who is opposing a $3,000 check to families, $3,000 benefit for kids. Like, that is a very politically popular idea. So it will be good for the GOP to get behind this. So I don't necessarily have the problem. The critique I have isn't necessarily of that proposal. I think it's the general thrust of these pro-natalist ideas, which a lot of the things that they have to imagine is that our current regime, its chief focus is racial justice, or how we can redistribute the wealth from white people to non-whites. And whenever these child benefits come up, they're going to be reinterpreted through this prism. And Romney's proposal is pretty good, but I can imagine that in order to pass it through the Democrats are going to reinstate the welfare policies that his bill wants to eliminate, and they'll probably add some racial exemptions that make sure that their people get more of these benefits. That's why it's crucial to approach the natalist issue from, does this help our people? And I would say that Mitt Romney's does help our people, but do other policies do? And I think there's a fundamental error that goes in with these people who continue to harp on pro-natalism when it comes to American policy, is that they believe that government policy can encourage people to have more kids, when I think it's much more of a cultural and social rot that's going on. The main problem we have is that white middle class people are not having enough kids. And I don't think that giving them more benefits is going to make them have kids or have more kids. I mean, it's not like somebody is saying, oh, I'm single, I'm in my late 20s, but now that I know I can get $3,000 a year with having kids, I'm now going to get married and have 6 kids. I don't think anyone's thinking through that. And there's also always been these arguments that saying that, as touched on before, is that there's all these people who have $90,000 in student loan debt, and that's preventing them from having children. And there's probably a few people, I feel that if you really want kids, you're going to have kids. And most of these people I know who, really want kids, and they're in a great relationship and they're married, they're going to have kids no matter what, even like it doesn't matter the cost. Now, they would like to have it made easier for them. Yes, and we should look at ways to make sure that those people are getting the proper benefits they need. But I don't think this is going to spur necessarily a baby boom here. And yeah, people will point out, well, Hungary has these family policies, and so did Poland and all these other countries. And it's actually better that they and do it because of us, because these are ethnically homogenous states where all these policies are going to benefit their people. When these policies come here, they're not necessarily going to benefit us because first off, our regime is hostile to our people, the historic American nation. And their policies, we already have pro-natalist policies. The problem is they go to people on welfare. They get more money due to the amount of kids they have. And that is something. So we already have this natalist policy. And whenever these people who pointed out, a lot of these people who call themselves post-liberals, they always say like, oh, we're couching this in the language of how this can help Hispanics and blacks have even more kids. And like, I don't think, those are necessarily the demographics that, that's the problem with the fertility rate. The fertility rate is that it's plummeting among the white middle class. And these people are fairly well off. They have great economic benefits. I mean, life is, there's a lot of new challenges and difficulties for them in the 21st century compared to their parents' generation. But they can still have the means to have children, but they're not. And they're also marrying late. And there's a problem of marriage. There's also the general problem of people are not getting married, which I don't think having the economic benefits are. I mean, if the question was there's all these married couples and they're choosing to have one child versus 2 or 3 because of the cost, then I would understand that. But the problem is that our people are the people we're trying to encourage to have more, children aren't getting married. They're delaying marriage. And when they get married, it might not be time to have children. And I don't think a $3,000 tax credit is going to change that. It's not economic reasons. It's social and cultural, and it can't necessarily be solved by the government. And I think you also have to, and the second other consideration you have to say is that I've touched on, is that, is this going to be another welfare program for non-whites, or is it actually going to help the white middle class? And I think Mitt Romney's looks like it is, because it's just a direct check. If you have the child, here's the $3,000 check. No questions asked. And we're eliminating welfare programs in the process. But our current government is not going to allow that to happen. They're going to make sure that every policy goes to benefit their people at the expense of whites. And that's something to keep in mind with that. And I think if you really can't replicate these policies that are occurring in Hungary and Poland, which are ethnically homogenous, and that everything that is done to benefit their people actually does benefit their people because they don't have a large immigrant population or an underclass of people who are hostile to the historic American nation. That's their people. If you're have a country that's like over 90% Magyar, yeah, you don't have to worry about these issues, but you do have to worry about this issue here in the United States of America. And thus, everything has to go towards these racial and cultural, seeing these issues from a racial and cultural perspective. And that is so critical to this. And without that, you could end up supporting a bunch of terrible policies that end up hurting our people, not benefiting them. Because on the surface, this works in Poland and Hungary. Well, yeah, Poland and Hungary are very different from us. I said there were 3 topics that I wanted to cover about how wrong it is to have this economic focus of a lot of these post-liberals are, people are trying to be populism from the right. Some of the aspects of populist thing. But there was another issue I wanted to talk about, and I've talked about this before, and people who follow me on Twitter know this is a special hobby horse of mine, is that their love of unions, which they all imagine that these unions could be made based again, and if they were ever based, and we can, we just need to start our own union, and it'll be conservative, and it'll really fight for workers' rights against woke capital. And I saw there's another example of how awful unions are, is that I'm sure most of our listeners read the article from Time last week that confirmed there wasn't a conspiracy to steal the election from Trump, and it united all these powerful forces from the Chamber of Commerce, organized labor, left-wing activists, big tech, even some Republicans were involved in this. So it provided all this institutional backing to ensure that Trump couldn't win the election, confirming every right-winger's conspiracy theory about the election. But the ringleader of it was an AFL senior official, or AFL-CIO senior official. Unions were at the heart of this matter, and they organized to ensure that the guy whose economic policies benefit them far more than Biden's, from trade protection, immigration restriction, and to pro-energy policies, they opposed him just because of civility. And now AFL-CIO is complaining about Biden's policies. It's like him eliminating Keystone Pipeline and his other energy policies are going to prove devastating to union workers. And now Richard Trumka is complaining about Biden. And it's like, well, you know what? You were at the center of this. Your organization was at the center of this cabal, which they called it a cabal in the Time article. And now you're complaining about it. So you reap what you sow. And the unions continue to be bad. I mean, if you're looking at what teachers' unions are doing, and you would be like, well, no, we only care about traditional unions, the steel workers and miners. And yeah, well, most unions are now more like the teachers' union than it is the traditional image of the union from the 1950s. And teachers' unions are trying to prevent our schools from being open. If they are open, they try to impose a Black Lives Matter indoctrination on them and critical race theory. And it's like, why do you want these organizations are fundamentally opposed to our interests? Even if it's in their interest to support us, as in the case of the AFL-CIO, they will be the ringleaders against us. Because they have the institutional backing, and I think people don't understand that even some of the policies they do on economics is it's very bad when it comes to unions. And unions, the individual union member can be won over to our side, as many of them voted for Trump, and many of them have voted for other good politicians in the past. But the unions themselves as institutions are fundamentally bad. And that's not to say that we, going back to the minimum wage stuff, it's I'm not necessarily, this is on libertarian grounds, saying they impede people's private property and we should just eliminate unions. They're fundamentally bad. And theory, once again, in theory, unions are good, but as they operate, they're bad. They're terrible because they oppose us from our perspective on racial and cultural matters. They're always going to support Black Lives Matter. They're now support mass immigration. They've supported mass immigration since the 1960s, even though for 100 years before that they were immigration restrictionists. And they fundamentally changed. So they're not going to support any of our ideas when it comes to crucial, even though their individual members will not support Black Lives Matter, and they will clearly don't like immigration because they know that threatens their jobs. But the individual member is good, but the institutions themselves are bad. And I think, this love affair with organized labor is really silly. And it's once again supporting people who hate us and hurts our own people. And you really need to have this, people are always talking about Carl Schmitt, the friend and enemy. We need the friend and enemy distinction. But a lot of these people who read Schmitt view their enemies as their friends and their people as their enemies. And that needs to be changed. So you need to always approach these issues. Does it benefit our people? And unions are, sadly enough, not the individual members necessarily, but the institutions are opposed to us. It's similar to the military. These generals are the generals are terrible, but the individual soldiers are good, or most of them are. And so that's how you need to operate with unions. Is the union members are part of the union for sensible reasons. They want to protect their job. They want better benefits, and many of them share our same beliefs and can be won over to our side. But their organizations that they're a part of are fundamentally bad, and they can't necessarily be changed by us. I think you may be we'll just start our own unions. Okay, good luck. It'll probably be as successful as starting your own Amazon, but I wish you luck on that matter. Now I'm going to introduce one of our listener, or actually the Patreon questions a little bit early, one of them at least, because it relates to what we've been talking about. A lot of these right-wing populists really love Huey Long. So one of the questions I got, and it's from Tony, he asks, Scott, what is your opinion of Huey Long? So this gives me a perfect opportunity to talk about Huey Long. Now some of our listeners may be like, who the hell is Huey Long? Huey Long was a governor and senator of Louisiana from late 1920s and 1930s. He died in 1935. He was assassinated. He was considered the greatest political rival to FDR at the time. FDR saw him as the biggest threat. He was technically a Democrat, as is the entire South was in the 1930s, but he was a very independent-minded person, and he considered a third party run in 1936 before his assassination. And eventually the third party, who was getting underway, did run some candidates. No, they didn't go very far, and the third party ended. And he was a populist. FDR considered him his biggest threat from the left. His biggest threat from the right was Douglas MacArthur, who was the chief of the army at the time. Chief of staff, Army chief of staff, I think is the proper title. And he saw him as this great threat. And Huey Long had a very working class populist style. It was very much like the Trump. He would go out, he'd have this flamboyant behavior, he would make all these jokes. He had really captivated audiences, an incredible orator. So a lot of people really like him because they see him as like what could have been. And many left-wing critics saw him as America's fascist because when he built this political machine in Louisiana, he had absolute control. He was pretty much the dictator of Louisiana. And unlike most dictators, he was a goofball. I mean, most people like see his dictator in this military suit and executing rivals. And instead, Huey Long would, like, in some flashy outfit, would be coaching the LSU football team, which is one of his jobs he had at LSU. He was essentially the real head coach of LSU football. They had a nominal head coach, but he would go on the field and would override plays and be there. I mean, I guess he didn't have enough time being governor and senator, so he also had time to be a coach of the LSU Tigers. So he was a very much of a, they didn't have necessarily WWE at the time, but a working class style that was really captivating to many people and to the rubes, you would say. While the elites hated him, they saw him as this demagogue who was just riling up the people. So there's necessarily a reason that a lot of people would like him is that the establishment hated him, and the normal hardworking people liked him. But there are problems with Huey Long, and I don't necessarily see him as somebody who is particularly relevant to our time period, even though a lot of people say, oh yeah, he was, yeah, no, his policies were. He definitely, first off, he wasn't necessarily a convinced economic populist. He did that because it was, politically expedient to do that. It helped him politically, which it did, having this economic populist message. And a lot of ways, his message, his agenda was almost bribing voters so he could have total power. It's like every man a king is like, you're going to have all this great stuff. You're going to have all this great wealth if you just vote for me, and I'll promise you the world. And a lot of the right has always been critical of this. They'll see as democracy will allow these type of demagogues who will just rile up the people, and they'll promise them the world, and they'll just bribe them with free food and or free McDonald's, free hamburgers, and they'll make they'll give them the whole world, and that's something that people have warned about. And then when it comes to Huey Long, who actually did promise that, they're like, oh, actually this is great. This is actually what we want. And I don't think it's necessarily his economic agenda is particularly relevant. And he was all about economics. He was a racial moderate when it came to the South. And even he said that every man would be a king. So would blacks. He would they were included as well in this mindset. He wasn't necessarily, there wasn't necessarily the identity and cultural focus from him, and compared to, there were several other populists in the South at the time who were far more racialist, such as Theodore Bilbo, was a senator from Mississippi who he and Huey Long did not like each other, had a rivalry there. But Huey Long had a national platform, unlike Theodore Bilbo, who was just considered a regional figure who was largely ignored. And whenever he said something racist, the media didn't pick up. It's like, oh, it's just the South. And so he didn't have a national reputation up until after the war. Bilbo did. And while Huey Long was arguably, besides FDR, the most famous politician of his time. So this was somebody who was able to move past the South and move past a lot of the Southern development that had occurred over the Civil War, and was one of the first Southerners to emerge as a national leader on his own terms. So there is something to be said on that. But when it comes to his message, it is somebody who is just promising to bribe people to gain power. And we don't really know what he would have been like as president. And all these people say, oh, he would have kept us out of World War II, and he would have built this great state. And they believe too much of the allegations that he was somehow a fascist. He was not a fascist. I mean, he was he ran a typical political machine. The problem is his political machine was more powerful and effective than any others that we had. And he had assumed total control of Louisiana that was built entirely around his personality, which there's not been very many examples of that in American history. But he didn't really have core set of political principles when it comes to non-interventionism versus interventionism. He died in 1935. Like this, this was not the number one issue in America or in the world necessarily what was going on in Europe. And his views could have changed, the further it got along with in European developments. His opinions could very well change. I mean, pretty much everyone was a non-interventionist in 1935, so it was easy to make those pronouncements. And, we don't really know what the way he would have governed. I mean, he could have just turned the United States government into a massive graft operation for his political buddies, or he could have transformed America into something that would have been much better than the New Deal. We really don't know what he would have been like. But I mean, there are so many better political examples. I think a lot of people like soy jack when they hear Huey Long. I mean, when Tucker Carlson mentioned Huey Long and said he was more hated by the elites than Donald Trump, which I don't really believe so. I don't agree with that necessarily. I mean, the difference between Huey Long and Donald Trump is that Huey Long had a loyal personnel around him who were able to advance his agenda and solidify his power. Donald Trump, of course, as everyone knows, had the opposite of that. One comparison I wanted to point out there. And, people were going crazy. It's like, he mentioned Huey Long is so base. I'm Huey pilled. And, there are admirable traits in Huey Long. I think it's very interesting how he was able to gain total control over Louisiana. And he could have presented he could have offered an alternative path to American history besides what the New Deal coalition wrought. So there are those things there, but I don't necessarily think I don't think what his issues were particularly relevant. And I don't necessarily think we need to adopt a message of just bribing people on economic matters just so we can have all the political power to dole out benefits to our buddies. Now, these are drinking buddies. It's not necessarily your people. I mean, yes, you do want to amass power and support your people. But it wasn't necessarily like this guy is like I'm smoking cigars with, so I'm going to let him run this operation. He's going to rake in tens of thousands of dollars from it. I don't necessarily know if we need to be supporting people who are involved in massive levels of corruption. But yeah, I think he's an interesting figure. I don't think he's a particularly relevant example. I think there's far better examples, but ultimately these people are considered racist, and it's not as politically it's not acceptable in polite society to say that they're good. I think when it comes down to, in terms of Southern populists, there are three better examples that are more relevant, I think, are more about our issues. And because they understood that culture and identity stand at the forefront over economic concerns. And those three are Ben Tillman, who is a South Carolina governor and senator, who was also involved in redemptionist efforts against the Reconstruction governments in the 1870s. He's always considered, this bigot. He's a stupid bigot now, but if you read his speeches, it was actually pretty articulate and well thought out defenses of his worldview. And then there's Theodore Bilbo, who used inflammatory rhetoric, but if you look at some of his policies that he proposed, it's not that outrageous. I don't necessarily say, but on Tillman and Theodore Bilbo, it's not necessarily an endorsement of all their ideas, but I just see these figures as somewhat more relevant to our contemporary struggle. And of course, there's George Wallace, which, there's a lot of similarities between George Wallace and Huey Long. It's like Huey Long died from an assassination. George Wallace barely survived his assassination attempt. Both of them were national figures that transcended typical Southern regional politics. They were very different from the average Southern politician, who was usually this good old boy who's just there to get along. Not necessarily a great orator, wasn't able to whip up the people, which both Wallace and Huey Long were terrific orators who were just able to enrapture thousands and thousands of people. And both of them could have been theoretically president. I mean, George Wallace, of course, ran for president. It just wasn't necessarily there were some factors that were preventing him from becoming president, but it wasn't necessarily a totally unrealistic idea that this is somebody who could have attained the highest office in the land. The difference is that George Wallace ensured that the identity and cultural issues remained at the forefront of it. He was an economic populist in many respects. He was not a typical bourbon Democrat from the South who's just making sure that the wealthy were protected. He was somebody who was looking out for the rednecks and the hillbillies in his region, and he did try to have massive expenditures on education so their children could get textbooks and stuff. Well, and maybe in some respects that may not be good, depending on what textbooks they were getting. It's probably much better in the 1960s, and so they're very similar individuals. I think there's a couple reasons. One is that George Wallace is seen as this horrible racist and bigot by our contemporary age. I mean, but compared to Ben Tillman and Theodore Bilbo, he's far more moderate. And I don't think if you read any of his speeches or see anything, you don't see anything particularly inflammatory there. And if you watch any of these videos, I've previously recommended on Twitter to watch the debate he has with William F. Buckley. And the whole time you're there, you would be shaking your fist in favor of Wallace because he's just like, it's very powerful. And what he's saying, you could be like, those same arguments could be used today for us, which I don't really see that in Huey Long. But the difference, I mean, another crucial difference is that Huey Long died from his assassination and was able to be a martyr. And we can say what could have been. Wallace survived his assassination and became really one of these pathetic Southern Democrats who, in order to stay in power, they apologized for everything they had stood for in the past. And, he was stuck in his wheelchair. And one of the last images of him is he's like slumped over in his wheelchair and he's in his late 70s. He cuts a very pathetic figure as he's there at the 50th, or it would have been the 30th anniversary of the Selma March. And he's there and he's like crowded around by blacks. And they're just like, he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. And like, they're just rolling him around. It just looks like a defeated person. And that was due to not necessarily due to the assassination he had. It was due to the politics had changed in the South, that if you were going to remain a Democrat, you had to appeal to black voters. And he realized he had to, make those apologies to stay in power. So he was able to, you now have these, in his last 20 years or so years of his life, you have this pathetic image of him that contrasts with the image he had cultivated in the early 70s and 60s. And that makes him less of an admirable figure. But if you look at what he was saying at the peak of his powers, it is still something that's a relevant message to us. And I think that more people would be better to have this adoration for, or not necessarily, I don't necessarily want to say adoration, but looking at prior examples for us to emulate and people to say that they were representing the type of political coalition that we want to make, I would say George Wallace is a much better example than Huey Long. Simply just because he was addressing our issues while Huey Long wasn't. And Huey Long was kind of this odd demagogue who was wanting to bribe the people in order to gain total power. And with that power, we don't really know what he would have done with it besides like help out his immediate circle of friends and family. He could have been the greatest president America ever had. He could have been the worst. We don't really know that factor. I think we would have known what George Wallace would have done as president, and it would have helped out our people much more than the people who were presidents at that time. So that's my concluding remarks on working class conservatism and my thoughts on it and the various aspects. And I mean, the last thing I want to say on that is that, we can have many different opinions on economics, but we have to place these cultural and identity issues at the forefront. And so that's the final thing I would want to say about that. But now on to our final patron question. And as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask questions for the time being until I'm kicked off, of course, to sign up for the patron option at Highly Respected's Patreon. This final question comes from Ryan. He asks, Scott, what is your thoughts on the Morgan Wallen situation? This is a great question, and some of our listeners may wonder, who is Morgan Wallen? Well, Morgan Wallen is a very popular country singer. I would almost call his style, even though I don't necessarily think that bro country's in style anymore, but it is kind of bro country. And I don't really necessarily like Morgan Wallen. It's like overproduced, like pop country. I don't necessarily like that. I like Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, and stuff like that. I don't like, and Hank Williams III. I don't necessarily like that style. It's not deeply offensive. I'd rather listen to that than many other forms of music, but he's not particularly good. But that doesn't matter because he's become a cultural symbol. He was recently was canceled by cancel culture due to the fact that he was caught on camera saying the N-word. And in the context of him saying the N-word is pretty innocuous. He was drunk. He's coming home late at night. One of his friends, he was like yelling at being a drunk asshole. And he's like, hey, you pussy ass African American. And he even said it like with an A at the end, not with a hard R. And it was really like him emulating rappers rather than him saying a racial slur, or showing a deep sign of racism, because that's what they say in rap lyrics. And I've heard many people who are like wiggerish say like that exact phrase when they're drunk and like talking to another white person. So it wasn't necessarily a racial slur directed at any black person, or in any like public context. It's like him drunk late at night going into his house, bantering. And for this whole reason, he was dropped by his record label. Radio stations dropped him. His talent agency dropped him. He's like banned from Spotify and several other platforms. But his record sales shot up like insane. Is like skyrocketed. His record sales, and the few places that where you can still get his music, they're reporting it through the roof. I think he's still available on iTunes. So this is like showing that the people in whatever way, they may not like Morgan Wallen, but they'll still like his music, just as like a way of saying, screw you to the big corporations that are trying to cancel him. And it's pretty outrageous, like how far they just like, it was like an immediate like cancellation of him. And, he issued an apology and such, and it was like a really groveling apology. And that still didn't help him. And it was just for saying this one word. And you have to look at like the type of music industry, the type of people they've allowed to continue to record music and be signed to record labels and to still be played on radio stations. You have rappers who've murdered people and sold drugs before. They're still allowed on the radio. Many of them have had serious sexual assault allegations placed against them. They're still allowed on the radio. And so all these things, but for just saying this one word while you're drunk privately among your friends is a reason for banishing you from, society. I don't necessarily think he's going to be totally banished. I think they're seeing the wide level of support for him that some record label is going to give him another chance. But unfortunately, he's probably going to come back and he's going to work with the NAACP and like be firmly committed to anti-racism and etc. So not necessarily be good, but it also had to look at, surprisingly, somebody pointed out another comparison, a good comparison with the Morgan Wallen situation. It was, of course, Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire. I don't necessarily want to give him too much credit, but he did make a good comparison between him and Nick Cannon. Nick Cannon, of course, was this washed up, family friendly rapper who's now gotten into some like radical black conspiracy theories. And on his podcast, he had called white people savages and made some vaguely anti-Semitic remarks. And for that, he lost some of his deals and contracts with major networks. But now he's regained some of these contracts again. They're allowing him back. And even though he called white people savages, who are like the worst creatures on the planet, he's allowed to come back. And and nobody even cared about that. But if you say just this one word among friends, the N-word, then you can lose everything that you have. So this is the type of society you have. And this is like the genuine like cancel culture. I think a lot of conservatives are defending him. But, we abuse the phrase cancel culture so much. Like I've been seeing it applied to Liz Cheney, that it's cancel culture to want to remove her from office. That somehow a normal part of our political process is cancel culture because you disagree with her politics. It's like, oh, well, I totally disagree with her person's politics, but I'm not going to vote her out because that would be cancel culture. The people who use that are the same people who want to actually cancel Trump supporters. So I don't know. The cancel culture is something like snowflake that has been widely abused, and now we don't really have a proper definition of it. What happened to Morgan Wallen is a genuine example of it. The same thing can happen to ordinary people, and it is good that like people are standing up to support him. We just have to hope that he doesn't go full cuck and just like make songs about how like evil racism is. He makes his apologies. Maybe he does like a community event with the NAACP. He does what he has to, but he then goes back to being a normal entertainer for middle America, which I guess a lot of people will like. As I said, I don't really particularly like his music, but it would be a success story, and liberals would be very mad about it. So That is all the time we have for today. Of course, I'll be back next week. Maybe we'll have a guest. Maybe it'll be solo, depending on what the news topics are for this week. So, just a few things. Make sure to hit like on my videos, subscribe to the videos. Also, start following me on Telegram and my handle on Telegram is Scott Greer, not Scott M. Greer. You can also follow me on Gab at Scott M. Greer. So, until next time, stay respected.